Hello everyone and welcome to the final Ibstock talk of this semester. We are presenting. For those of you who don't know me, I think quite a lot of you do, I'm Matthew Jones and I teach in second year undergraduate architecture planning, architecture and environmental engineering, and in the first year of the MArch degree. And today myself, Rachel Sara, who is an associate professor here in the school and is program leader for MArch, are going to introduce Hands-on Bristol and the MArch Live project before a number of our students who worked on projects last year are going to talk about the projects that they did and took through to completion and the process of that. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Matt, and thanks for inviting us to talk about this this kind of collaboration, I suppose. The idea of Hands-on Bristol is that it is a collective, and it's a collective that's mainly emerged from colleagues here at UWE who wanted to work somewhere between practice, between research, and between kind of academic work. And so we, as I said, we are a collective, but one of the things that we always do is work with the MArch and run a series of live projects with them in the first term of the first year of the MArch. We also do kind of a range of different projects, including working with a kind of refugee asylum seeker build project, collaborating with a designing and making architecture festival in Lewis called Making Lewis. The first and the second year MArch this year worked together an intensely crazy fast 1 week project at the start of term to create the Architecture Centre's 20-year anniversary party and the bandstand associated with that. So that's the kind of stuff that we do. And part of the hands-on collective approach is that we act as a platform to bring together community members, architects, trainee architects and academics to work together, and the intention is always to generate outcomes that make a positive change within the city. We're kind of interested in a different way of making architecture. This is the website that you can take a look at if you want to see the range of different projects that we do. So in the talk today, we're going to gallop through some of the projects from this year, some of the first year MArch who are, a few of them have come to join us. We really appreciate it. Woohoo! So we're going to gallop through some projects from this year, but then talk in particular in more detail about two projects that started off as those live projects from the MArch last year and carried on to be realised in a more permanent way. And these guys from the second year MArch are going to talk about those.
Okay. I suppose the other thing just to say about how we think about this is that we're thinking about this in a sort of expanded field of architecture, that there are other people who are thinking about architecture in slightly different ways, including spatial agency that some of you might know about, which is a whole collection of people questioning the role of the architect and doing projects that explore what architects can do and how they can work with communities and in innovative ways and so forth. And then there are practices such as Assemble there on the right, a cooperative of architects, come artists, come makers, who are very much a socially engaged approach through their work and through their practice. And looking further afield, we quite often look at Rural Studio and the work that Rural Studio do. For those of you who don't know their work, they're an Alabama-based design and make university kind of collective, and have been working for a long time making structures out of DIY, reclaimed and cheap materials to better the lives of people in their area. And the other one there on the left is the Tuskegee School, I think I said that right, which again has a very long legacy of design and make projects and taking students out into the real world to experience what what impact they can make. But also then there's other ways of teaching architecture, and we sort of see ourselves fitting within this. The Sheffield School of Architecture has for a long time run live projects, and Rachel, you did your PhD on live projects there at the school. And then also the Live Projects Network tries to bring together a whole broad range of people working on these sorts of projects as another kind of knowledge base for this. And we kind of see ourselves fitting into this body of knowledge, I suppose, and this other way of teaching architecture.
So this is the working definition, continuously building definition of what we think we are doing. So we define live community architecture as a form of spatial agency, referring back to that example Matt just showed, which involves a community or not-for-profit organisation in collaborating with architects and or architecture students to co-create a brief, timescale, budget, product and a process for their mutual benefit. And as we said before, it's really important that the intention is making a positive impact in the communities. So the projects shift the emphasis away from the notion of the architect as a sovereign expert, sole and individual expert, to the practice of creative consultation, participatory placemaking, practices and co-creation. And that is for knowledge generation. So we think we generate knowledge through the process. And we're also making explicit that community activist potential of the practice. This is the way that the projects typically run in the M-Arch. As I said, we're talking mainly about the M-Arch projects today. So students first meet with client to develop a detailed brief for the project. They survey, record and produce drawings and models of the existing site and uses. They then diagram the network of actors, the network of stakeholders involved in the project, and then engage in some way, do some in situ participation, consultation process, and you'll see lots of examples of that. Through that, develop their own creative proposals, present those proposals back to their client, and produce a feasibility report. And so typically, students are working in small groups of about 4 or 5 students with a real community-based client. The next slide is one of these. So students from in this slide are working with Elm Tree Farm, which is a farm for people with learning difficulties and especially autism. As part of the project, students worked on the farm for the day, which is quite important for us to engage kind of deeply with the client. And they then carried on to develop kind of a consultation process. They went to the farmers market, which Elm Tree Farm is connected with, and turned themselves into sandwich boards and consulted with people about what they knew about Elm Tree Farm and what might kind of work. And ultimately, this led to the development of proposals for a self-build building on the site, which they then kind of fully worked out, had a guesstimation of costings, and ultimately, you know, we hope that that will be used by Elm Tree Farm to gain funding to ultimately build that project. I think it's you next.
I think so. So at the other end of the scale, that project had quite a defined brief. This project for with Up Our Street in Easton and Lawrence Hill, the group of students working on this year, they looked at an entire zone of the city, mapping out the green spaces and analysing what they were used for, what was in them, and what those spaces could do better. And they got very involved in making these little sort of installations that they dotted around the neighbourhood and so on. And they also did a lot of consultation activity, starting with an ice cream stand where they made a little stand. They went out. Was it a lemonade stand? I think it was lemonade. Was it lemonade? Yeah. Lemonade, okay. A lemonade stand, and they went out and met people in the community, moved around the area, and found out what people thought of the spaces and what people would like to see there. And I think you got on the radio as well, didn't you, and that kind of thing. And that then led to these quite elegant little designs of plug-in furniture that could be used in lots of these different spaces. I particularly like the soaring action there. And then focusing on one space in particular and taking that principle of this DIY furniture and making it into larger planting beds, growing areas, and making a place out of what was a derelict playground. Also in Easton, another group worked at the Junction 3 housing development, which, if you're coming down the M32, it's the big brightly coloured housing on the left just before you get to the city centre. And in the middle of that housing development, there's an empty green space. So the idea was to work with a local forest school made up of residents and to think of lots of ideas for that space. And so they ran events in it, and they kind of mocked up forest school activities using scrap store materials, and then developed this landscape idea that was a series of outdoor rooms for different activities to take place in.
This is another project from this year, an ongoing relationship we have with Totterdown and the Totterdown Residents Association. This year they were working with the steps, which I don't know if any of you know Victoria Park, but there's a route down the steps which is kind of links I suppose Totterdown to Victoria Park. And they engaged with these steps in various different ways. One of the first things that they did, which I think was a very quiet intervention but very valuable, was they just spent a day cleaning the steps and picking up litter picking and sorting it all out. And through that process, people came and talked to them and to find out what they were doing. This is a later intervention which showed them introducing colour and later on these lit seats that they put into the space. So the idea is a lot of these projects involve some kind of design-build intervention. This is one of the projects which involved a kind of very much an inclusive critique of the Bristol Enterprise Zone, and they began to create a big analytical document, but also began to look at what interventions you could make into public interventions to begin to raise discussion and begin to raise critique. So this is one of the posters that I think they created for the project.
I think this is the final one from this year that we're talking about, and this is a project with a group called Babassa, who are a group that are trying to build business expertise and skills sharing between local people in St Paul's, mostly St Paul's I think it is, isn't it, and local businesses. And the way that they want to do this is through this hub idea, where people can come together and meet and share ideas and share skills and so on. And so this group, they went out and using this sort of blackboard idea, met lots of people, gathered lots of ideas, and that led on to the design of a number of options for an office pod that could be moved around the city and relocated to lots of places. And this is one of the designs for that. It hasn't come out that well on the slide, but it's a sort of furniture pod idea where the walls of it, rather than just being structure, can be used as desks, as storage space, and so forth, and then it kind of can be reconfigured in lots of different ways and combined together to make a bigger space. So just now to move on to the two projects that we want to discuss in a bit more detail. So the first one is a project that's part of our ongoing relationship with Bedminster Town Team, who are a group who are concerned with the upkeep and improvement of the area of Bedminster, and in particular the High Street areas. The first project that we worked on with them was, I think, in 2012, where a large group of MArch students looked at the entire High Street and did interventions along it that were trying to get lots of ideas for the improvement of the High Street. a little bit later on, a couple of years later in 2014, a live project group of, I think, 5 students went back to do a second project that was slightly more focused on two particular streets. And they went out and had a stall at the market, and they got people to write on this bubble what they thought would make the area better. And this guy really caught their imagination. Things that make life more absurd. That's kind of great. That would be, things that make you think differently about the place you're in. It's a really kind of good slogan that you can kind of go with. And so they did. And so they developed a whole project that was about making people rethink the spaces that they used every day. And they were doing a lot of this through colour and through very temporary installations, with the focus of one street that currently has blank walls of Wilkinson's on one side, a car park at the end. It's a kind of not very nice cut through between 2 quite busy roads, a high street and then a traffic road behind. They sort of reconsidered it as a gallery space, and they arranged for the road to be closed down for a day, and they held this huge event where people came and they painted the street, and they painted boards that had been made, and there was a bouncy castle and music and lots of fun and things. And so that project was really trying to make people think about how spaces could be used differently. Which then leads on to last year's live project, which was, again, much more focused. And now I'm going to hand over to Connie, Anna, and Amy to come and talk about the project that they were involved in.
So our project was commissioned by the Bedminster Live town team, and it was a little pocket of space just off the busy street of North Street. And it's on the street. The presence on the street is an old Victorian gate, cast iron. It's very beautiful, but it had been severely run down. There was a lot of building waste. There overgrown vegetation. It was a bit of an eyesore. And people coming through on North Street took no notice at all. It was just a precious little gem within North Street that was just forgotten. So our idea was to get the public engaging with this little pocket of space. And we were playing around with some ideas on what would benefit the street, what would benefit the residents, the community, and even just as simple as acknowledge the gate. So our first intervention was, as you can see, is this very simple fairy lights. It was to capture the imagination of the people walking past. This gate is just forgotten. People going about on their routines, their commute, it's just not noticed. It's just a bit of rubble that's on the street. So us, by introducing the fairy lights in the middle of winter, it was a cold, wet, rainy day, it was about getting that intrigue, getting people to stop, actually have a look at this space and have a look at the gate, and actually intrigue them to say sort of, well, what's going on here? We never noticed this before. And that's what sparked our project.
So leading on from that initial investigation, we decided to hold a community engagement event. And in a similar vein, I suppose, we wanted to draw attention to the gate. So we decided to set up this stand and attach lots of strings to it, which people could then populate with comments, basically, written onto acetate. So this became a sort of installation on the street that would have this dual purpose of attracting attention to the space, getting people thinking about what they wanted to do with it, what they wanted to see happen, but also as a device for collecting these ideas and displaying them. And we really wanted to get the community fully on board, and we wanted to get a certain number of votes so that we could obtain funding from the government's Pocket Park programme, which we managed to do. So with this funding, we were then able to put together a design for the space behind the gate, and this is what we came up with.
So after the initial talks with the community, we also spoke with the client, who were Bedminster Town team, but also the landowner, who were a housing association. So we kind of had multiple discussions and a kind of collaborative process with them, which set out design parameters and criteria that our design had to fulfill. So a couple of the things, for example, were the fact that it had to be very temporary, seeing as it was private, effectively private land that we were opening up to the community. So temporary, they didn't want people just walking through the site because it was actually an old public footpath. So there were certain elements that kind of were dictated what we ended up designing. But the final approved idea by both the client and Nightstone, and also obviously to fulfill kind of our own academic brief as well, was to design this a storytelling park. So it was to create a space that local residents could come and share stories, or children could use for reading groups or storytelling events and things like that. Basically, we were really inspired by talking to the community. Is that another one? The idea of all the generations sharing stories with each other, and how powerful that can be at uniting a community which at the moment is quite separated. So yeah, the final design was a bench that kind of curled around the site and provided a seating area, but also maybe a performance area or a stage, and also blocked the footpath, so it became an enclosed space rather than a through route. So I think that's the last one we got, yeah. So that was the kind of end of our involvement as students, because the university project had come to an end. We then, because with the design idea, the project kind of took off and got sufficient funding for it to actually go ahead. So at that point, Rachel and Matt and everyone took over from us and continued on the project. So I think hand back to them.
Thank you. Thanks. So, yes, the project got funding from the DCLG, the Pocket Parks funding, and with a contribution from the client as well. Had a budget of, I think, about, was it £12,000? Yes. So following on from all the really great work that the Live Project group had done, we started to push this forward and think about how it could be developed. And we ended up working between Hands On Bristol with George Lovesmith, who some of you may know is a first-year tutor, and a local maker manufacturer called Uma, to develop the bench a bit further. But the first thing that we did was we opened up the site and we invited people to come into it, and we held a day where we cleared a lot of the waste from the site. We took out all the rubble. Sorry.
I just think it's too slow.
Ah, is it? Okay. And we had made by Uma and George this mock-up of part of the bench, and there's a lot of testing and prototyping the joints and so on to take what the Live Project group had done and to make it into something that could be realised and affordable within the brief. So that's the day on site, and we had a really great response from a lot of local people who then became very much involved in the project going forward, and we invited them to stay involved and become part of the project. So this is a bit of site clearing going on. We had loads of bags of rubbish at the end of it, and a lot more interested people, and a lot of people who really loved the bench. And we were there, and the Live Project group came as well.
So this is a half-scale model?
And that's the half-scale model, which has now gone to Southville Primary School for them to use in their library. So there we are, again looking cold, clearing the site, opening it up. with a display at the back of some of the project work, making some space where this bench could actually fit in. This was the idea of the storytelling bench, and that there could be a little library that goes in there and people could donate books and take books from the site. And then there was a process of actually developing it, making it, and getting it installed on the site, which again we ran as a community barn raising event and invited people to get involved in that. This is Rachel measuring the site. I don't know. But this is the gate open, this is the seats in place. Most of the timber was donated by a company called James Yates, and this is the owner of James Yates. I'm not sure if he is James Yates. James Latham, sorry. Yeah. And so we invited the people who contributed, the timber supplier, the people who we'd met at the first consultation. There's a lot of cake, which is obviously very important in all live projects. There was a local storyteller who got in touch and asked if they could come and perform at the opening of the storytelling bench. Loads of local people came in. I lurked behind some bushes. Yep, there's me again. Mostly hiding. We took in some plants, and it was a really good day, and I think it was really nice to see one of the projects go all the way through from working as a live project to take it all the way through to completion. And then it has a life afterwards. So the people that we met on those days are now the Ebenezer Angels. So at that opening ceremony, we ceremonially gave them a key, and they've taken this on and they treat it as their own space, and they run events and they run the upkeep and they run the maintenance of it. And they've arranged for other people like Lloyd's Bank to come in and do some planting with those rather delightful multicoloured tyre stacks, which we kind of turn a blind eye to, maybe, I don't know. But then also, when things have gone wrong, they've been there to fix it and make sure that it's kept open. And so they're investing their time in this space and making it a part of the community. And even so far that someone wants to get this space, I don't know what it is, registered so people could get married there and have little marriage ceremonies as part of in this space in the middle of the community. And there we are, there's some people enjoying it in the summer. So that's Ebenezer Gate. And then continuing to work with Bedminster, this year we've had another live project group working on another pocket park site a bit further down East Street, the main high street, and they went very yellow. And they were looking at sort of the everyday aspects of the street, like the yellow lines, and taking those and seeing what you could do with those. And they ran a consultation event on the side of these two phone boxes, which unfortunately can't be moved. Again, found out what people wanted, and they designed a quite simple little timber structure that has some similarities to the Ebenezer Gate project, but also then has this yellow maze that becomes hopscotch, that becomes a counting game, that wraps around it and over the top of it and so forth. So we're continuing to work with Bedminster Town team, and again there's a funding bid attached to this, so it's another one that could continue and have a real legacy. So the other project from last year that we wanted to let you know about was Under the Flyover. So Tom, Luke and Matt are now going to come up to talk about that one.
Thanks a lot. Hi everyone. So we're going to talk about the processes undertaken during our live project. Our live project seemed to just stretch on forever, nearly a year, so we've got quite a few slides, so we'll bomb through those. So our site was the Cumberland Basin flyover in South Bristol, and this is it during the 60s. It did have a park there. It was demolished in 64 due to pollution from the cars, and then a few years later the EU stopped lead in the petrol, so it sort of demolished for no reason. Since then it sort of fell into disuse. And our client was Anna Wilson, a local artist, and she set us sort of an overarching brief to complete a series of physical experiments on the site. And they sort of split up into three phases, with the first phase being a bandstand that had a series of conditions. It had to be movable, it had to be made of recycled materials, and that was because it had Anna was involved with Bristol Green Capital, is that right? Yeah. So it had to be made from reusable materials, it had to be collapsible, we had to move it down to the site. So it had a load of these conditions. It also had to be used by a band of up to 4 members. So there's sort of lots of different conditions we had to work around. So this is just a site location. And this was a week-long project, so we had a week to come up, design, build, and complete this whole project. So we started off, the 3 of us, bashed out a load of sketches. We just sat in the tobacco factory and just went through a load of ideas. And eventually sort of came up with this sort of programming. We thought about it had to be high, maybe it could be split up into 4 different units. And then we just straight away moved on to model making, and straight into a one-to-one model that we could then talk to the client with. We invited Anna down for the day, and we talked her through this. This was sort of after 3 days of the project. And she gave us the go-ahead. And so we started figuring out the actual details, how we'd make it, where we'd get the materials from, and push forward with that. So this is us in the workshops. It was, like I said, a really fast project. So we didn't really have time to think about much. We just had to go straight into the making. So obviously they're quite tall. We made them outside of the studios. We had lots of different troubles along the way, especially with the joints. All the joints are sort of in tension, so the ply started snapping. We had to rethink a load of things. We had to think where we'd get the canopy from, how we'd get the pallets, how we'd get the wheels, all those trolleys that you see as you walk in that people have nicked from Sainsbury's. We took all the wheels off those, kept the trolleys in our studio, used those wheels and then put them back, so kind of recycled them. We then loaded them up, got one of our friends to come down, loaded them up into a trailer and took them down to site. And the event that was going on was the Portway Sunday Park. So essentially they close the Portway, the big road that goes under the Clifton Suspension Bridge, for a day, and that becomes a park. So it's actually really nice. It changes the acoustics, and you can ride your bike down it, skate down it, and they organise for a band to come along. And it's kind of like a really nice family day. So we built those on site, got down there really early, constructed them. This was some of the imagery that we came up with prior to the event. So this was sort of just a concept idea, and actually the end product, it sort of ended up looking quite similar, which was quite nice. So this is the event. This is the band playing on the bandstand. And actually, when they were on it, they were sort of jumping all over it, and these things were moving all over the place, but they did hold up, which was nice. And at the end of that project, we entered it into a competition at the LFA to be exhibited in London. So we produced this image to sort of convey everything that we'd thought about while designing what we called the Wayfarers. Unfortunately, that didn't go ahead, but it was still quite a nice thing to sort of undertake.
So phase 2 was basically to cultivate what was possible. So from previous consultations that our client had had with the community, we'd also chatted to people amongst ourselves and sort of got these general ideas of what could be done on site and what people wanted on site. So what we started to do was sort of, oh, hello. we started to play around with elements of site and intervention, and we made this particular model to sort of have a community engagement tool which later on performed a really good piece which children could interact with, which we'll explain later on down the phasing. So we sort of just started playing around with sites, turning flyovers into swings, using all reclaimed materials which stemmed from the original part of the brief, which was to use reclaimed materials as and when. Again, further experimentation. The idea that the original brief was to create a mugger zone. So a mugger zone being sort of like a multi-use games area. So that's what the client and the community really wanted. So what we intended doing was sort of zoning off an area out of netting to create that as a safe space to kick a ball about. Because obviously with it being next to flyover and heavy traffic, we didn't want anyone to get hurt or kids to run out. So back into university making, there was a lot of making in this project. Which was really, really good, because I think a lot of the times with architects, from our point of view, you get stuck in the digital world and not enough making is done, and through making you're forced to make choices there and then, not sort of thinking too much into the future. It's sort of just holistically moving forward. One thing we've really realised through doing this is advertising is really key to community engagement and community projects. So even subtle things like creating posters, making social media statements and like posting things out is really key to gathering attention for it. Well, our particular project, even though it had a lot of community engagement, the actual space itself, we struggled to sort of bring people in to really help us. We had a lot of people come along to events, but actually helping us during the process. We struggled to find those particular people, which again is sort of like a reflection on the sort of process of community engagement work. And this was the event. Now, unfortunately, on the day of the event, it was absolutely terrible. It was like gale force winds, some of the heaviest winds we've had for quite a few years, and torrential rain. So the turnout was minimal. But still sort of trying out ideas and playing about with certain materials to understand how we could zone spaces and sort of just testing some things. And then phase 3 is define the vision.
I can't even really remember what phase 3 was. It's been a year since we looked at this, really. So phase 3 was to try and take what we learned from phase 2 and design a an area for the whole thing, you know. So what worked and what didn't in phase 2, we then set up this sort of idea of putting them all into one thing. But then actually, Pocket Park, that's you guys.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. So just going back to that one, so we had all these ideas that came from the community, came from us proposing a few things, came from like some engagement, and we came up with like a application for funding, and it was literally these 2 drawings we sent off, just trying to convey that we take all those ideas and make something which we hadn't actually designed yet. We sent a few sketches of what perhaps it might look like, but that idea changed very quickly. So we started off that process with more community engagement. We were able to use the model again. We set up community engagement days, and this is once we'd been awarded the money, we were able to sort of plan this, and some of the money we actually got from the HCCA, which is the Hot Wells and Clifton Wood Community Association. They sort of match funded us, and some of the conditions of that were to put on these community workshops so we could engage with the local people. So through that, we sort of came up with some designs or something that might work. We had workshop days on site, and local kids came down, and we used these hay bales to just play around with, reconfigure the site. And from that we came up with some designs. So this was again based around the mugger pitch idea, sort of a multi-sports area. And we figured perhaps we could make these of concrete so they couldn't be moved, and they'd sort of create a pitch, but also be able to like be used by a series of different people. There were lots of different activities going on at the site.
Just one key thing, even though we decided to make that concrete, one thing we want is that they can be moved with the pallet truck, and that was one real key thing that came right from the beginning, is the idea that in balance with council permissions and legislation, having something which is movable but heavy enough that people can't move without that pallet truck was sort of a weird equilibrium that we had to try and sort of create, which sort of came through experimentation.
So these were some like initial concepts. And then we just started drawing up some sort of more formal drawings, and started doing some material experimentation here at uni. So this was a mock-up of like a sort of quarter-size piece. And again, we documented the whole process and kept posting it on social media so we could like stay in touch with the community. And then back to the workshop, we had to hire a workshop closer to the site. This is Puppet Place down on Spike Island, where we ended up doing a lot of making. There's only sort of 2 photos of the making, but the making of the formwork for the concrete was like a massive element and took several months actually. We ended up with 60 pallets. They were all found or like reclaimed. We just ended up driving around trying to find those. And most of the wood is from the timber recycle yard, so that's all reclaimed. And once we'd finished the process, we actually used that wood again afterwards.
One quick key thing is during that whole process, we'll point out that we were also doing our major projects. So understanding the balance between live project work and how that then follows on, and also trying to balance your university life was a good experience for the real world of sort of juggling various things at the same time, which at some points became very, very, very stressful. But
so this is another workshop day that we put on. We took the formwork down to the site, sort of to represent what the blocks might look like, and invited people along. I think this was another Portway Sunday Park, so we had families there, and it was quite successful. People were playing on these, so that was quite good. And then straight onto this is pouring the concrete. So we'd made up all these squares. There's 12 of these, and each one has formwork within it. You have these tubes that poke out. They're basically so that once the concrete's formed, you can put scaffolding into the blocks to sort of build structures off of it. And due to the formwork, we had to cast these all upside down. So actually pouring the concrete was quite a stressful process. It doesn't come out as you'd imagine. It wasn't ready mixed, so initially he just poured gravel into them. So once we turned those over, we didn't get the exact finish we wanted, but again, it's just, I suppose, a learning process. So then we hired this gantry to turn these over. Each of them was about 1.6 tons. So yeah, it's quite a struggle. But you can see once they came out, they looked okay. So we had to do this in 2 stages, I think. And then finally, this is the launch day that we put on. We invited people to come down and interact, and it was quite successful. We put up the net again so that people could play and use it as a pitch. The two sort of end blocks acted like goals, or you could sort of throw balls at them and that sort of thing. And that's just a later photo taken by someone from the community. That's how they're arranged now. We turned all the wood left over into planters that could also be moved using a pallet truck. So each one of them can be moved and reconfigured, moved around the site because the site is quite large. And yeah, we'll leave it at that, I think. Any questions?
Thank you so much, guys. I just wanted to add that, so I suppose what the 2 projects are just show 2 quite kind of different ways in which the initial live projects from the M-Arch continued. So in the first one, these guys probably very sensibly said, no, we didn't want to be involved in the next stage, or we wanted to be involved but not running it. And then these guys, perhaps foolishly but brilliantly, said that they wanted to maintain involvement. And you did end up being paid for some of your work, especially over the summer. We are always doing kind of these kind of projects, so it's very open to anybody to get involved. We've got a project now that is sort of mysteriously hanging around. We don't quite know what to do with. So if anybody wants to get involved in these kind of projects, I suppose connect it with their university work. They're very, very welcome. So yeah, do you all want to come up, and does anybody want to ask any questions? Stand up. Yeah, you might as well. Well, I don't know if you might have any questions.
So 1.6 tons, how big a pallet truck do you actually need?
It was just a standard Euro pallet truck. The maximum it can take is 2.5. I mean, even though they are movable, it's right on the limit of it being movable. You can lift it up, but you would need 2 to 3 people to push it. But in the eyes of the council, they are movable and temporary in the eyes of the people which interact with them. But yeah, it was, because it was like an experimentation in itself, it was a very close risk. We did actually fill some of those concrete forms with polystyrene and some other elements which we got from scrap source, just to sort of volumize the internals to sort of minimize the amount of concrete used.
And is this something you would like to continue in practice, because you're close to graduating? Is this a theme that any of you could answer that, whether it's something that we're making you do or something you could see continuing?
I'll quickly say my one and then I'll pass it down. I think personally for me, I would love to be involved in this more. I think sitting in front of a screen is good in some ways, and it's good to think forwardly as architecture teaches you through education, but actually working with people at a more intimate, empathic scale and more holistically, I find far more interesting, but also having your architecture head on at the same point and understanding the repercussions, the implications, and sort of the wider network and entanglement that work has in like a bigger context.
Well, I agree, but I would like more of a mix. I wouldn't want to do this all the time. I don't want to be sat in front of a screen all the time. So if there's a way of getting best of both worlds, that would be ideal. Really?
I think I learnt a lot working with a client. I think having Anna there was invaluable. She offered like so much, but it also that relationship is quite interesting because it sort of tested us sometimes. Tom and I would have different ideas, and I think that sort of taught us a lot about, you know, potentially like the workplace. But yeah, I'd like to definitely continue this sort of work in future.
It was a really interesting project because, well, so many of us can just get sucked in, as we said, behind the screen, just working very second hand for the client. It was sort of really an eye-opener to actually get down there, get your hands dirty, speak to the end users, really find out what they want. We had a brilliant time with our public consultation. We had some really interesting thoughts. And it was nice to just get in there and experience it as the end user instead of that second-hand designer, just sitting behind the screen and doing what you think they would like instead of doing what you know they would like. It was really, really interesting. So with our site, it was a site that was already being looked at by the Bedminster town team. It was something that they were trying to explore with themselves, trying to look at how they could utilise this space. It was also, as we mentioned, it was a private property of a housing association. So it was dealing with them, but it was something that the town team were trying to push forward, and we just aided them.
Our site was already being looked at by Anna, our client. She was a local artist, but also she'd been working on it for a number of years, trying to like push stuff forward. For example, she got the columns painted and that sort of thing. So I think it's still an ongoing project for her. Yep. So that was set up through UE, so through Rachel. Yep.
So what we basically do is it started off through probably our collective informal connections, saying we wanted to do these kind of projects, working with community groups. But now it's got a little bit of a momentum. We've done exhibitions at the Architecture Centre and so on. And so now clients tend to kind of community clients, community groups tend to come to us. Plus we have these ongoing kind of slower relationships like the one with Bedminster and with Totterdown that we're kind of building on year. It's got to the point where there are more people wanting to work with us than we have people available to get on with the project. So that's how it's kind of come about. But I feel like time-wise we ought to end it. So I just want to say thank you so much to everybody for presenting.